Hello, and welcome to the latest installment of LP In Depth, where we take what's going on and look at it from a little bit of a deeper perspective. That's normally the way we do things, but Alex is here, and it's been a long week, so we're going to do a South by Southwest recap and kind of see what we've learned about Disney and their content through the week. Now, this year, South by Southwest was virtual. South by Southwest was one of the first events that got canceled last year because it was right about this time, a little bit earlier last year. And there's a lot of Disney stuff that was supposed to happen, including Bob Chapek, who was head of parks when they announced it. He was CEO by the time, was supposed to give an update on technology at the parks, which
as a keynote speaker, like
it was. And there were several.
You don't know, each day during South by Southwest, there's a keynote speaker, and it's usually somebody of immense clout. So that was a big deal that he was invited.
And there was several sort of Disney tangent stuff, including they were going to have a New Mutants was going to be there. Some folks from National Geographic. They usually have a big presence there. So this time there was less, just because there was less to begin with. But there was some Disney tangent presentation, so we want to talk a little bit about those and what they shared. And so I think I'd like to start with National Geographic's Genius. Is this airing tonight?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we can do that. I figured we'd start with the thing for Disney Plus, but Genius is a great place to start as well. Premiering tonight on National Geographic. They're doing, over the course of the next 4 nights, 8 episodes, 2 a night. And Friday would be Aretha Franklin's birthday. And so by then, all episodes will be streaming on Hulu. They'll each appear the next day. So tomorrow you can watch the first 2 episodes on Hulu, but you could hypothetically watch them all together there. And so they did a presentation. They had the first episode available for streaming for South by Southwest attendees. Cynthia Erivo, who stars in the show, was joined by executive producer Brian Grazer, director Anthony Hemingway, writer Susan Laurie Parks, who is a Pulitzer Prize winner, and then costume designer Jennifer Bryan. And they really kind of gave a lot of information, particularly from Brian Grazer, about how Aretha Franklin was determined for this installment of Genius. It's an anthology series. This is the 3rd season that they've done. It started with Albert Einstein, and then they did Pablo Picasso. So they had a scientific genius, an artistic genius. This time it's a musical genius. And one of the things that was interesting was Brian Grazer said they had a list of about 100 names they were considering for the series. And Aretha Franklin was kind of chosen at the last minute when she passed away. And then suddenly, she was at the forefront of their conscious, and they kind of realized how amazing her musical abilities were for having not been able to read sheet music, not having any real professional training, but inventing new chords like mixed together that had never been done before, and also being able to communicate with musicians who had gone through professional training exactly what she wanted, taking what was in her head, being able to communicate that in such a way that she got exactly what she wanted on her records or her albums. And so that is happening right now, starting tonight. If you're on the East Coast, I think it's probably already in the middle of the first episode, or maybe even the second episode has started. If you're on the West Coast, it starts at 8 p.m. So definitely recommend checking that out. If you have Hulu or the Disney Bundle, you can watch it there. With each of the 2 episodes will appear the next day.
So this Genius show started, as you mentioned, with Albert Einstein on Nat Geo. It was kind of their signature anthology series in terms of scripted. I mean, It's based on real people, but it's not like obviously Nat Geo is a lot of reality or nature programming and historical programming. But we know that the next installment was still produced by National Geographic and Imagine Entertainment, but is going to be coming to Disney Plus with Martin Luther King Jr. Now, what having seen a little bit of the show, what do you think that will mean for Disney Plus?
Well, I think it'll be interesting. Obviously, I think the life of Martin Luther King Jr. is one that's going to be pretty family friendly. Like there shouldn't be much objectionable content. Obviously, it'll get into a lot of racial segregation and right versus wrong and things like that. You do get elements of that in Genius Aretha, but I would say Genius Aretha also deals with sexuality. It's just part of her story. Her mother was basically she lived in a brothel as a child, and at a certain point was kind of turned away by her mother and told, you go and no, I'm sorry. What am I mixing up? No. That's right. Her father was a reverend. Her mother didn't really get along. She did have time living there. And then by age 13, she had a baby. She had her first baby at age 13. And that's something that a lot of, she never really spoke publicly about. So I think content wise, there's elements there of Genius Aretha that probably make it not a great fit for Disney Plus, which is more of an all ages streaming service, but works well for Hulu and obviously National Geographic can do some pretty mature content. But I think it's great to have the Martin Luther King Jr. series on Disney Plus. It makes me question what the future of the series holds, if they're gonna stick to more I would say like characters whose stories have family friendly appeal, like for an all ages category, so they can get by with PG TV 14 type content.
Now, you and I have kind of speculated who will be after Martin Luther King. And, now that National Geographic's part of the Disney family, and they've done artists such as Pablo Picasso and obviously Aretha Franklin, kind of wonder if Walt is, that opens up a whole can of worms, but you kind of can't help but wonder if Walt is being considered.
I have to imagine that Walt Disney was on that list of 100 names, because if you have a list of 100 people that you consider a genius from all facets of creativity, I don't see how he's not on that list. I'm wondering if maybe before the Disney acquisition of 20th Century, if that would have been maybe harder to do, but now I feel like you could do it very easily because it's all in-house. They don't have to like search for licensing or royalties or any of that through the Disney company. And so I would love to see it, especially if they're going to be continuing this series aimed for Disney Plus going forward. It would make a lot of sense. I think it would also answer a lot of questions, because you and I were just at the Walt Disney Family Museum today checking out their World War II exhibit, and there's a lot of, I would say, like urban legends about Walt Disney, and people try and characterize aspects of him. You'll hear things like he was racist, he was sexist, he was homophobic, all these things. He was a man of his times, but exemplified in that World War II exhibit was a section of the exhibit was about Japanese Americans in being put into internment camps. And one of his artists who did artwork for consumer products and merchandising, it wasn't called consumer products back then, but like one of the big things she did was the Fantasia, the artwork for Fantasia that was on the program when you saw it in the roadshow format. And she was working for Disney out of the New York office. And there was a story there about Walt visiting New York and, coming right up to her and asking her how she's doing, in the midst of this, when I think it said even her family was in an internment camp, but because she was employed as an artist, she wasn't put in one for some reason. And, you asked her how she was doing. And one of the things he told her, she said, when people ask about my ethnicity, I say, well, I'm Japanese, but I'm Japanese Korean, or I'm Japanese Chinese, and, trying to mix it to make it seem less scary to other people. And he said, you shouldn't have to do that. You're an American. When they ask, just say it's none of their business and I'm an American. And she did that from that day forward, and I think that stories like that speak a lot to, who he was and what his, what was in his heart and what his intentions were. And I think it would be interesting to see some of those represented in a scripted series. Also, if Tom Hanks's game, I think, he's worked with Ron Howard, he's worked with Brian Grazer before. I think it would be fun to have Tom Hanks reprise his role from Saving Mr. Banks.
So there was also another National Geographic show, this one coming to Disney Plus. There was a presentation on it. Can you talk a little bit about this one, Secrets of the Whales?
Yeah, Secrets of the Whales, 4-part documentary series coming to Disney Plus this Earth Day. Each of the 4 episodes will focus on a different type of whale. And in the presentation at South by Southwest, it was James Cameron who produces it, the James Cameron of Avatar and Titanic fame, and then National Geographic explorer and photographer Brian Scarry, who has basically spent his whole career photographing and documenting the ocean, and he's been behind a lot of National Geographic, not only photos but video content. This looks really fascinating. It's about how different species of whales have different cultures, and they really made it sound like that's the story they're telling, that basically these different whales, not only with species but even within the species, their subcultures, have unique cultures to their family unit, their pod, their community, that humans will be able to, I guess, relate to more than we ever have before. One of the stories they told was, I think it was beluga whales have a different greeting, almost like a dialect, depending on where they're from. So when they meet another beluga whale in the ocean, they can basically, with their call, tell that other whale, hey, this is where I came from. This is where I typically live. And I'm, on a journey right now. And then, asking, where are you from? And by their call back, they know like exactly what part of the ocean that whale comes from. Orcas in particular, that was really the main focus of this episode, because kind of like regional cuisine in the United States, in the South, we, crayfish and gumbo and, spicier Cajun foods. In the Midwest, it's a lot of German and Norwegian inspired, American fusion. Out here in the West Coast, California, we're being more health conscious, kale, things like that, Greek yogurt. So kind of in that same vein, there are pods of orca that specifically hunt stingrays. There are some that specifically go after herring. And, so there were these amazing stories of orcas getting themselves into waters that are shallower than they should be in, where it's almost a danger to be beached, but they would go there because they had chased all the stingrays in there. And then they're so smart, they flip them on their back, which induces the stingrays to go to sleep so they don't get stung, and then they start eating. And even a story, it's a matriarchal society. The eldest female in a pod of orcas is the leader. And he was documenting them, and they had been following him for a while. And orcas do use what's it called? Sonar? Or not sonar, echolocation. And so they can see inside your body. Like an orca can tell a human woman is pregnant sometimes before she even knows she is, because they can see, everything that's going on. So he said it's like being scanned by a supercomputer when he's with them, and they know he's not a threat to them. But they do see him as competition for food sometimes. And one of the stories he shared was a female orca, the matriarch of this pod he was following, recognized him as being not well fed because he didn't have blubber. Brian Scarry is a very skinny guy. And so she took one of the stingrays that she had like turned upside down and like put it on the floor and like swam back and watched him and was like, are you going to eat it? No? Okay. And then she went and grabbed it and took it for herself, but she was like offering it to him. Really cool stuff like that. They talked during South by Southwest a lot about the environment and a lot of the man-made threats that are impacting whales in the ocean. And they said that the documentary series is not really about that. That's not the main focus. Really, it's more about getting humans to understand just how much we still don't know about whales. But there will be undertones about that. Another story that they told was I think it was near Alaska, and they witnessed basically a funeral procession of orcas, and it was for a calf. The mom is kind of balancing it on their nose, and they're just, you can tell they're very sad. And the realities is about 50% of orca calves now die after birth, and they've done studies, and it's because of plastic toxins that get into the ocean. They get into the fish that the orcas eat, then they get into the womb, and then it creates this toxic environment for this baby. So this baby is born without everything it needs to survive its first couple days in the waters. And so this is more common than it should be now. So things like that, even beluga whale breeding ground, they talked about, they've historically gone through this one specific channel in Antarctica that, now because waters are, the glaciers are melting and the waters are opening up, now there's an increase in boat traffic. And beluga whales in particular have very sensitive hearing because they're typically in waters where people aren't, so they're not used to boat traffic noises. And they witnessed a boat coming through like a mile away, and the sound was loud enough to scare them off. And he said it was like a stampede of beluga whale leaving their breeding ground, and they didn't come back for a week. So like things like that, they kind of opened up more about the environmental impacts that they witnessed over the 3 years that it took to make Secrets of the Whales. Because really it's mostly Brian Scary. Another thing that's really impressive about it, I'm kind of hoping they do some kind of behind the scenes extras on Disney Plus for it, is because of the noise and it scaring them away, most of the footage Brian got free diving, not with a scuba gear on his back.
Wow.
He's a professional, and he can hold his breath a lot longer than you or I could. But it's basically he's out there, just with his flippers and his camera equipment. And, he knows once he finds them, which was also part of the problem, was, trying to find these whales. It's not like you can sit on a savanna in a camouflage tent, having masked your human scent with a camera and wait for a lion to show up. You've got to find these moving animals to begin with. But then, diving underwater. And so he said, usually, the shots you're seeing were taken within like a 2-minute span, and then he's got to come up for air and kind of reset and go back down. So it's interesting. I'm really fascinated by the story behind it, and I can't wait to see it. I think it's going to be phenomenal. And orcas are already, top of my list of favorite animals because I grew up with Free Willy, so I can't wait.
So moving on to Hulu and creatures we know little about. Sasquatch is coming to Hulu on April 20th.
Yes.
The release date has me concerned, but you tried to explain this to me, and I might not be smart enough to understand it. But what's this about?
Okay, so I should start by what I learned from the filmmakers, which is that prior to making Sasquatch, they worked together on a Amazon Prime docu-series about Lorraine Bobbitt. And so following that, the director was interested in doing a docu-series about a murder, but something that you couldn't Google. So he kind of knew he needed an unsolved mystery. From there, a friend of his was telling him about this like Sasquatch Chronicles podcast, which is not a joke, where people call in and talk with the podcast host about their own personal Sasquatch, Bigfoot encounters. And he started listening, just thinking this is stupid. And then, got kind of fascinated about the level of fear that these people had. So he put out some feelers amongst his friends in the film community asking, does anybody have a crazy Sasquatch story that involves murder? And then the main guy who's basically part of the series, I'm drawing a blank on his name right now, I can pull it up. But he basically responded back, I have just the thing. And the presentation, I should say, was called Weed, Murder, and Bigfoot. So David Holthouse, he's an investigative journalist now. When he was in his early 20s back in 1993, he went to visit a friend in Mendocino, that's for those of you who don't know, I didn't know this going into this, so I had to be educated by the film. But Mendocino is where the best marijuana is grown. Like, it grows bigger and better there than pretty much anywhere else in the world. So obviously in 1993, it's illegal. And these are remote areas, kind of the middle of the redwood forest, and an area that hadn't been demolished, because, they kind of start the documentary talking about the redwood forests and how, as it became leveled and turned into agricultural use, this became like the sweet spot because it's very hilly. It's hard for people to find you. So people just started planting, their little farms here and there. Anyway, in 93, while he's there visiting his friend, these two guys come into their barn at night, freaking out, like they've seen something terrible. He describes it as feeling very real. This didn't seem like a joke or a gag. It didn't seem like they had been, told to say these things. And they had just happened upon another farm where all the crops had been broken and destroyed, but nothing taken. So, typically that would be a raid, and nothing had been taken. And 3 farmers had been obliterated, like torn limb from limb. And in the ground were Bigfoot footprints, and there had been sightings all around this area. In fact, Mendocino still to this day has more reported Bigfoot Sasquatch sightings than anywhere else. There's a museum up there. Like, it's kind of a big tourism business. There's even a Bigfoot motel that people stay in when they go up, on vacation, hoping to see a Sasquatch. So that's really what the story is. It's David Holthouse returning to this area with just this story that he heard when he was in his early 20s as a lead, and investigating it like you would any cold case. It's 3 episodes, each an hour long. They'll all be on Hulu the same day, and it takes some weird turns. It's not exactly what you think it is, and I became very addicted to it very quickly. I highly recommend checking it out. I'm not usually one for these murder type shows. Like, I've not seen Tiger King or Making a Murderer or any of those. I feel like that's the crowd Sasquatch is kind of aimed at. I would say there was nothing in it that was too gruesome for me, and they actually used animation to kind of fill in the gaps of, anything that he's hearing about from other people. But it's really interesting, this trail he goes on. And because even though, marijuana is legal now in California, and this is being grown in California, they get into it's still a very dangerous thing to do. A lot of people are growing it for the black market because it's more profitable, and all the dangers of that. And it also, the area has a higher missing person per capita rate than most places. So it gets into this whole thing where, there was this alleged triple homicide in 1993, presumably by a Bigfoot monster. And like, these 3 men were never even reported missing around that time. So all very interesting. Highly recommend it.
So also on the Hulu documentary front, you got to see and learn about, let me get this title right, WeWork, or the Making and Breaking of a $47 billion unicorn.
Yes.
So there's our unicorn right there.
There is the unicorn. His name is Newman, Andrew Newman, I'm pretty sure. Yes, Adam Newman. And for this presentation, it was the director, Jed Rothstein, and producer Ross Dinnerstein. And they were with a moderator from Forbes. I guess this is Forbes's first kind of co-foray into documentary filmmaking. And so Forbes is like a backing partner on this. Obviously, with Forbes involved, they had access to a lot of their own reporting that they had done. And Adam Newman, the founder of WeWork, did not participate in the documentary. So kind of like the Fire Festival documentaries, Fire Fraud was the Hulu one. They didn't get the head of that organization to participate, but still fascinating. They speak to as many people as they can, a lot of former employees, because WeWork is still a company. It's not profitable yet, but the subtitle, or the Making and Breaking of a $47 billion unicorn, really goes into, they basically, Adam's vision was for WeWork to be the next Google, Amazon, the big tech industry giant that just kind of came out of nowhere and was an overnight success. Not that any of those have those same stories, but it seemed that way. And so that was kind of what he was going for. And it is fascinating. There are some Firefest type moments. Like they would do these WeWork summer camps that were mandatory for the employees. And it was like a drinking binge-a-thon in, northern New York and in the woods. And they would get big named artists. Ashton Kutcher would come every year and do like a keynote speech. And, so it was like these outrageous parties, these outrageous lifestyles. And then also beyond WeWork, it gets into all the subdivisions of what became the We company, which included We Life or We Live, which was like a housing thing, like people lived together in an open shared space environment. So they show lots of that. And also We Grow, which was their failed attempt at like preschool or early childhood education. And also his wife is Gwyneth Paltrow's like second cousin. She's featured for a moment in the documentary, not new footage interviewed, but like to help promote We Grow. She was like brought in, presumably paid. But really it's a company that is misrepresenting their revenue, making it seem like they're this, overnight success and this is revolutionizing the world, when in fact they're losing money faster than they can get investors on board. And it all led to this failed opportunity to go public, where they were valued at 47 billion. And then by the end of the day, it was clear they weren't worth even $1 billion. So it's very interesting. And it also gets into the fact, unlike fire fraud, where, things that the head was doing were illegal and he is doing jail time for it. Unlike that, everything that Adam Newman was doing is technically legal. So one of the things they talked about during the South by Southwest presentation was they kind of expected when they started making the film that he might be facing some indictments or criminal charges, none of which ever happened, because as far as what is allowed in the American business legal system, everything was by the book. So it kind of speaks to that too. Like, what does it say about those rules in place on a federal level for businesses, that everything that happened here was totally kosher with the law, even though, so many people lost their livelihoods, being taken on this ride.
That's interesting. WeWork was one of those companies I never quite understood, because
I knew it best from it being parodied. Like, I loved the Comedy Central series Broad City, and that was like a whole subplot. Alana had basically started her own WeWork style thing, but it was outdoors, and she was like stealing internet from a cafe, like with an Ethernet cable. And so she had just like taken desks out of the trash and chairs and stuff, and like made it on a street corner outside. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Jason Alexander was a guest star in that episode as like one of the like entrepreneurs using her outdoor space.
So I will say Hulu also has shows that are not documentaries.
Mm-hmm.
And you saw one of their a little presentation about one of their animated shows.
Yeah,
during its second season later this month. Mike will have full coverage. Actually, his review of season 2 will go up tomorrow, and then we'll have full coverage leading up to its Friday premiere. But you got a little bit of, what's that?
March 26th. I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So same day as the Mighty Ducks, Game Changers. So make choices. What did you learn about? What's that?
I said, or plan for both.
Yeah, it's Friday.
Yeah, Solar Opposites was an interesting presentation. It was very fun, I will say. So it started with, first of all, I should say the full title was Solar Opposites Table Read and Schlorpian Silent and Alone Disco. So they did give us about a 2-minute sneak peek at the second season premiere episode, which was very funny. And then they did a live table read all over Zoom, with the cast, but reading through the script of the season 1 finale. So kind of like recapping how last season ended for fans who are going into season 2. It included all of the main voice cast, including the co-creators, one of whom is the voice of the main Schlorpian alien. And then after that, they had a DJ, and I don't know if you've ever been to a silent disco before. It's something I've encountered on cruise ships, particularly the Disney cruise ships. And the concept is everybody has headphones on. And so the DJ is like mixing a couple tracks. At the Disney one, you can like even change genres. So like I can be listening to pop, Ben can be listening to country. We're both dancing, but like we have no clue what the other one's listening to.
I'm a little bit country.
I'm a little bit rock and roll, but this one, it was an 8D audio experience. So if you had your headphones on, the sound was kind of like going, forward and back, and obviously stereo left to right. So that was pretty cool and fun. And they had a lot of fun with the backgrounds. It was like characters from the show kind of blending and merging and being like ripped apart, but in not in a gross way. Just, kind of like the Windows media player when it would do all the weird like colors.
Oh yeah, the visualizations.
Yeah, it was that kind of thing, but like with the characters thrown in, but it was a lot of fun.
So yeah.
I was gonna say they didn't like take questions. They weren't really talking necessarily about the upcoming season, but they gave about a 2-minute teaser and then really just celebrated the success of the show, which I think is Hulu's #1 original series.
Oh, really?
Streamership, I think I read. Like Handmaid's Tale is #1 in terms of like awards and clout. I think it was dethroned in terms of like streaming numbers because this is from the creators of Rick and Morty, which has a huge following. And I guess this series was originally planning to go to Fox, the network, Fox Television Network, not Disney owned or affiliated, and they passed on it, and that's when Hulu nabbed it.
So one other group from Disney, the mighty Disney conglomerate, did some presentations, FX.
Mm-hmm.
So what did you learn from our folks at Small F? Is it still? No, they don't do that anymore. Back in the day, their logo was, let me see if I can find it, was a small F because they wanted to appear friendly.
Mm-hmm.
And then a big, like the 20th Century Fox spotlights.
But now it's just all big FX and has been for like a decade.
let me pull it. Here it is. Let me share my screen so people know what I'm talking about. This is the FX I grew up loving, and it only lasted 3 years, but I
So you grew up with it over 3 years?
What's that?
Very formative years if you grew up with it?
No, like 94, I would have been 12 to 15.
Okay.
Not old enough to drive my car, so I had a life, but old enough to watch TV. And it had Batman on it, A-Team. It's like Nick at Night, except during the day. So I could, but in any case, now you got this boring logo.
Well, I was going to say like the second one there, which is just an evolution of like what we currently have. That's probably when I started watching FX with things like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, which I think was like my first FX show that I became hooked on. But I'll start with Hysterical, if that's okay.
Of course.
Which is a documentary film that comes on FX April 2nd, and then it will be on Hulu April 3rd. And it's a documentary about women in comedy. It's very funny. And the kind of the goal of the film is to showcase what women in comedy have endured and have gone through to kind of get where they are. There are some big names in it, comedians that you'll kind of instantly recognize, and maybe you don't know their name, but you've at least seen them in things because quite a few of them have crossed over into like sitcoms and even movie acting. And then a couple who are kind of like newer to the scene. And it's interesting, particularly coming off of, we're a couple years after the start of the Me Too movement now, but a couple of comedians were, swept up in that movement. And, they kind of opened some eyes about like, behind the scenes, it's pretty bad. And especially when you're not only as a comedian, but as a female comedian, where some clubs are less willing to have a lot of women on the bill, like they've talked about getting turned away from clubs because it's like, oh, the nights you're available to perform, we already have a woman on the bill. We don't want more than one, as if that's something that they need to monitor, or if it tilts the balance, if it's 50-50, like society, what are we going to do? Things like that. But it is funny. They're all naturally funny. They do touch on some serious topics, but I would say nothing is too heavy-handed, and also most of the topics that they're bringing up at this point, if you've been paying attention to the Me Too movement, it's really just kind of reaffirming what we already know. But it's interesting, to hear. We now know, entertainment industry in general is a little harder to break into, but comedy in particular has been, long believed to be, a man's world. And I think having something like Marvelous Mrs. Maisel too, which they don't talk about at all in the show, but I think it's poignant coming off of that on Amazon Prime as well. Some of the comedians who participate in the South by Southwest presentation included Fortune Feimster, Rachel Feinstein, Marina Franklin, Sherry Shepard, Eliza Schlesinger, and Jessica Kierson. And she is also a producer on the film. And she was originally, during South by Southwest, she talked about how this project came to be. She was originally attached to be part of a different documentary about comedians that was more, I think it was more general. She didn't really elaborate much on it. But the plans for that fell through. And by that point, she had already been working with Campfire, who I will say also produces Sasquatch, and Campfire seems to do a lot of things for Hulu. So she was already working with Campfire on this comedy documentary, and then they decided to kind of pivot and go for more of a women in comedy. Also, the director of this, Andrea Nevins, she's directed a previous Hulu documentary as well, Tiny Shoulders or Small Shoulders, the body image issue documentary. So it was really good. And one of my favorite parts of the film came from Fortune Feimster, who, like, they show bits of some of their sets of comedy, and she's talking about, Lifetime and a network that's aimed at women. And she said, all the content is about, being raped or murdered. And then finally she's like, girl stuff. That was funny. Also, I will say the documentary gets on the ways that women in comedy have kind of pushed the boundaries a little bit. One of the documentary speakers had breast cancer and was able to incorporate breast cancer into her set in a way that's, like, not only funny, but profound and meaningful. And, she talks about after her shows, she'll have women and men who come up and say, like, thank you. You've kind of given me either a way to laugh at it or, tools to kind of talk about it easier, making it easier to talk about. Another, Sherry Shepard has a child with special needs. And so she talks about that. It took her a while to kind of find an entry point where she could talk about it in her sets and still be funny. But she's gotten to that point too, where parents will come up who have kids on the spectrum or with Asperger's and, just thank her because, what she spoke about really spoke to them in her set. And it was funny as well. And they also, pay tribute to a lot of the women in comedy who came before, at a time where it was even harder to enter the scene. And that was interesting. And during this, one of the questions was, who are their personal inspirations? What was interesting is most of them were picking women who were on sitcoms, so people like Lucille Ball, or variety shows, Carol Burnett. But for Sherry Shepard, she listed Whoopi Goldberg, and I think it's kind of funny. A lot of people forget that Whoopi started as a comedian and then, hasn't done stand-up in a long time, but that's where she rose up through and made a name for herself, and then, transitioned over to acting and now talk show participant.
As someone who's not, I don't see a lot of comedy on its own, but you hear funny people. I always find it surprising how challenging women find it in comedy. Not that I don't, know that there's sexism out there, but so many of the comedians that I grew up with were female, in terms of like, Lucille Ball, Carol Burnett, Phyllis Diller, Joan Rivers, not that there weren't men, Don Rickles and all that stuff, but like, you never thought about it because, there were so many fantastic performers, that were comedians on television, but you don't necessarily realize, the comedy club scene, which I, as a kid, I didn't go to, wouldn't has been as balanced as, television, where you typically have family comedies and things like that. So you're always going to have a sort of a natural balance, but I just never, I didn't realize how hard it could be for them Until you start talking about this documentary, and in recent times I was like, oh, you know what? Yeah, those were the aberration, not necessarily the norm.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, it was interesting. It was, again, it was like there were moments of it that were very eye-opening, and then there were moments where it's like, coming off the Me Too movement and everything, we've learned as men who didn't, live in these scenarios. It's interesting to have this as kind of a companion to it.
Also, so you also attended a panel for a show that I find fascinating. Not that I've seen it, but Dave, right?
Yes.
Dave is a show on FXX, which nobody watches.
Nobody watches it?
Nobody watches on FXX, but it's on Hulu. It has become a hit. So more people find it on Hulu when it's like, it wouldn't carry its weight on FXX. I mean, first of all, I don't think like FXX is a very popular channel to begin with, this nation. But
I know it's where, so FXX, my understanding, or at least this is how I perceive that channel, is FX had enough series of clout that they moved the series of not clout to FXX. So like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, like not necessarily like an award-winning show, but obviously long-running and a fan favorite. So like FXX kind of became, here's where like the comedies go that don't win the awards, and if you want Fargo, come to FX. FX was like the premium brand.
So, I mean, it's one of the success stories they talk about with FX on Hulu, where people will find it on Hulu who might not come across it on FXX.
Yeah.
So, can you tell me a little bit about what you learned about Dave?
Yeah, well, they mostly were talking about filming the second season, which doesn't have a start date yet. They've promised it's coming sometime in 2021. But a lot of the conversation, I would say at the beginning, they talked a little bit about how the show came to be in general, which was interesting. And then it transitioned more to what they're working on for season 2, and really the complications of it due to COVID, but also having Dave and Gata, the two main characters who are based on their own lives, be a part of that. Now, the origin story of the show, I think, is really interesting. I don't follow rap. I have nothing against it, but like generally it's not a music genre that I gravitate towards. And I had kind of in my teen years, I would say, got into like some comedic rappers, but I didn't realize it was still happening. So Dave Bird is Lil Dicky. That's his like internet persona, and he's Jewish. He's, very stereotypical Jewish. And so the things he raps about are obviously different. And as you might expect with that name, sometimes he's talking about his own genitalia. So I hadn't seen the show before South by Southwest. And actually, the first episode opens with a scene where he's getting a physical at the doctor and has to pre-explain that his genitalia is not normal and why. And kind of like, so he doesn't surprise the doctor with that. So instantly, it's a weird show. And then it's about, this white Jewish rapper who is trying to make a name for himself. And so in the first episode, he meets and befriends this guy named Gata, but I haven't seen the rest of the show. I've only seen that first episode, but I really enjoyed it. And I guess throughout the arc of the first season, Gata, as a black man, does start to talk about mental health, which is based on his own struggles that he goes through. So the show gets very real while still being pretty funny. Producer Jeff Schaefer was part of the South by Southwest presentation, and one of the things that was interesting, they asked Dave Bird, aka Little Dicky, about his own television influences growing up, and he listed specifically Seinfeld and Curb Your Enthusiasm, which, for those of you who don't know, Curb Your Enthusiasm is a Seinfeld-esque show, but it's about Larry David, who helped co-create Seinfeld with Jerry Seinfeld, and George Costanza was based on Larry David. And so this is a show that's, obviously still fiction, Curb Your Enthusiasm, but it's like in that world, people know him as being the real life inspiration for George Costanza, and that becomes kind of a running gag. So anyway, he was inspired by that. So very much the show of Dave is kind of Dave Bird's life, fictionalized and kind of overdone for comedy a little bit. But it was a really interesting presentation. spoiling kind of where season 1 goes, by the end of it, Dave gets a record deal, but at the same time, everyone around him that has kind of been his support system is also finding success in their own lives. So kind of the through line of the second season is going to be Dave not really having the confidence to produce an album on his own, but also not having his support system readily available to be there to hype him up and give him the confidence he needs. So that's kind of the short version of what fans can expect in season 2. Dave and Gata talked about being very nervous while making the first season, and they did it so fast that they didn't really get to sit down and watch playback of their performances. So they were just kind of going through it, high anxiety, hoping this all worked. And I didn't know the story that it wasn't a success on FX, but found success on Hulu. But it's interesting to hear them talk. Now they're at a point where they're comfortable making the show and being on camera and acting, but now there's these whole new challenges where it's just a very sterile environment because of COVID. They're a show that doesn't use sets. Every location is a real location. So if they're in a living room, it's somebody's living room that they're borrowing for the show. So they talked about that adding another layer of complexity to the shoot because they don't have any sets that are in a soundstage anywhere for the show.
Interesting. So anything else?
I feel like that's the main beat. I think the big thing is just right now, because they're still trying to film the second season. They've got some of it done. I think FXX is waiting to announce a more specific time frame other than sometime in 2021 for when fans can expect the second season of Dave.
FX is famous for sort of not rushing shows. The show comes when the show comes. So
well, and speaking of the next show that was presented at South by Southwest is very much that way. I tried to get into Fargo and it was a little too violent for my taste. But I looked at like when seasons of Fargo have come, and there have been gaps of up to 2 years. And we're already at the 1 year mark, or almost at the 1 year mark, I think, from the last season, season 4. And they have no like concrete plan. So that was one of the questions they asked of writer Noah Hawley, writer, director, and I think showrunner of Fargo. So a lot of roles he plays. But they asked him about the 5th season, and he does have an idea for it. But he hasn't gotten around to writing anything yet. And he revealed that he's working on something else right now. So he said by the end of 2021, he thinks he'll have time to actually sit down and start putting pen to paper or fingers to keys and, getting an outline written to the point where they can actually start making progress on a 5th season. But the other thing about Fargo is I guess each season doesn't reuse the same cast. They jump forward in time. And this last season was the first season to jump backwards in time to the 1950s. And then the majority of the conversation, they had Andrew Bird as part of it, who's better known as a singer-songwriter, and this was his first foray into acting. So Fargo is known for some interesting casting choices that have proven very successful. And Noah Hawley kind of talked about, in his mind, he's not writing parts for an actor, he's writing characters, but it'll be something kind of unconventional. He didn't realize he had an unconventional approach to casting. So typically it'll be something like, for example, Fantastic Mr. Fox, the Wes Anderson animated film. That was how he envisioned, I'm drawing a blank on the actor's name who's in all those Wes Anderson movies, but he envisioned him for a role in Fargo based on his vocal performance in Fantastic Mr. Fox, which, few people would connect those dots. So here it was, he wrote a character and pictured Andrew Bird, who's never acted before and is a singer-songwriter, and actually met him at South by Southwest 2 years ago. And after a performance that he gave, met him backstage and proposed to him that he wanted him to be in the next season of Fargo. And he took a little bit of convincing. And then they talked a little bit about, just being on set. And similar to the story with Dave and Gata for Dave, Andrew talked about how he didn't really get to see playback. So kind of the whole time he was filming, he was anxious about, I don't know if I'm doing a very good job. And then obviously, months or however long it takes later, he gets to watch the finished show and, felt like he gave a convincing performance. And he did share, he is interested in giving acting another try and taking on a different role. But that was interesting. And Noah Hawley kind of downplayed a little bit, I think, the challenging work that actors have to do on set. He kind of summed it up as, you learn the lines, you say the lines, and you do it with, an emotion that reads. And, I think for a lot of actors, they might be insulted by that oversimplification of it, because for a lot of people, they put a lot more thought and time into crafting their characters and their performances for the people who, take it very seriously.
And Noah Hawley, one of his big projects coming up is the FX, I don't know what you call it, spinoff of the Alien franchise.
Alien. Well, and he's obviously has success taking a movie and making it a show. It's a very good Sigourney Weaver animatronic you've got there. I do think her eyes go left and right, or went left and right, I should say. Past tense. I wonder where that animatronic ended up. Is she in the archives?
So many questions. So that's South by Southwest.
Actually, there's one more that hasn't published yet that I did attend for Freeform.
Oh, that's right.
For their new show that's starting soon called Cruel Summer.
It's a cruel summer.
Yeah. It's only by Jessica Biel of Seventh Heaven fame. So she was part of that along with producer Michelle Purple, and they had actresses Olivia Holt and Chiara Aurelia, who play the two main characters. The show takes place over a 3-year span from 1993 to 1995, and I haven't seen the episode. By the time it was something I wasn't on my radar, and then by the time I realized it was there, the maximum number of view counts for South by Southwest content had been reached on the pilot. But one of the things that was interesting was they filmed 9 of the 10 episodes, and so the actresses don't know how it ends yet. So they shared some fun stories about, particularly Chiara, like trying to sneak peeks at the script because they haven't seen them yet. And they talked a little bit about how she and Olivia Holt have become good friends while making it, and they actually live next door to each other. It wasn't clear if they were in like houses or apartments, but they were down in Texas filming the show and kind of took a break to do this virtual presentation for South by Southwest. But it sounds like the show has some kind of darker undertones. Obviously, it's made for the Freeform audience, and things like Pretty Little Liars have done well on that channel. So felt like it kind of had a Pretty Little Liars vibe to it, mixed with nostalgia for the 90s. And Jessica Biel talked a lot about that, how it's the era she grew up in, so it's fun to kind of bring it back to life. In terms of things like costume design and music that you'll hear in the series, they're very careful to make sure each of the 3 years feels slightly different in those regards. Even like hairstyles will change between 93 and 95, but still feel period correct. And then they asked the actresses about some of the items from the 90s that they interacted with on set that they weren't so familiar with. And Olivia Holt specifically talked about how clunky her Walkman is that her character uses. And she talked about how, like, in one scene, she had a fanny pack and the Walkman was too big to fit in her fanny pack, which I think is kind of funny, because I definitely had a Walkman that could fit in my fanny pack.
Okay. So, all in all, how was South by Southwest virtual? Online?
Yeah. Well, I mean, unlike Sundance, which I got to go to in 2020, I didn't get to go to South by Southwest in 2020 because it was canceled. And I hadn't, been doing this full time before where I could go before. So this is my first exposure to South by Southwest. But overall, it was fun. It was very different from Sundance. Obviously, it's not necessarily a film festival, and definitely the focus seemed to be more on TV and streaming than it did. Oh, cool. That's neat. Yeah, there's a lot of focus on music at South by Southwest, which right now doesn't intersect so much with Disney. I know there was a Demi Lovato documentary that's, I guess you could consider it Disney adjacent because her career started, at least she became a name on Camp Rock and had a record deal with Hollywood Records for a while and things like that. Her career really started with Barney, but she's no longer really like with Disney. Disney didn't make the movie, so we didn't really cover it because it felt a little tertiary. But yeah, it was interesting. It was interesting that it was like Sundance, but more for music, TV, kind of things. Like movies definitely seem to be less the emphasis.
So we'll wrap that up and we'll go to the section of the show where we're going to ask you, what was your Disney highlight from last week?
Ooh, Disney highlight from last week. Does that include last Sunday or last weekend? Sure. So last weekend we took a road trip down to Southern California. And so I would say that was cool getting to be, go to downtown Disney, getting to eat some Disney quick service food, getting to go into the Star Wars, what do they call it? The Star Wars store.
Trading Post?
Trading Post, the Star Wars Trading Post. That was really cool. So I'd probably say that was my highlight from the last week. What's yours?
I'm going to say, this is kind of off the beaten path, but, Disney recently announced, ESPN recently announced new deals with NHL and the NFL, which means at least until the NBA deal expires, that all 4 major sporting leagues, and then if you want to throw in, Major League Soccer, which is like the 5th, are going to be on ESPN again. And I think that's pretty cool. And the new deal, Disney kind of got the shaft on last deal. They paid so much and got so little that it's nice that we get they got more. They got ESPN Plus is involved, especially on the NHL deal. So it's nice that Disney's able to find ways to straddle both the traditional ESPN, ABC Sports kind of line with also having heading to the future for ESPN Plus. But that's kind of wonky. What are you looking forward to next week?
Well, you brought up, you reminded me that the Mighty Ducks Game Changers is starting. That's a franchise I grew up with, and it was fun as a kid seeing, like, I think particularly Kenan Thompson, because I loved him from Heavyweights and all that. So he came in on the second film. So I really became more of a Mighty Ducks fan, probably on D2 than D1. But also because of Mighty Ducks, I ended up playing hockey as a kid. I grew up in the Midwest. So I was a goalie. I couldn't move so great on skates, so I could kind of stand in one place and go side to side. But yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to see that franchise return. I also want to comment real quick. Thank you, John, for watching. I have ordered AirPods, so hopefully that'll help. I'll start using them because we certainly don't want to break anybody's ears. We appreciate you letting us know. What's your most looking forward to, Ben?
It's a good question. I would have said Mighty Ducks, but you took it.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
What about Falcon and the Winter Soldier episode 2?
Yeah, I feel like I use WandaVision so much that like I feel like I can't go that route.
Genius Aretha?
That is probably it. I'm looking forward to Genius Aretha. I love Ron Howard, I love Brian Grazer, I love Aretha Franklin, I love Nat Geo, I love Disney. It all just works out. So I think that's what I'm most looking forward to.
Great.
So looking up ahead to LP this week, it's the quiet before the storm. But we're going to have Jeremiah at Busch Gardens, as well as at the opening of All Star Movies tomorrow. And he'll also head into Magic Kingdom. And then, starting April 1st, which is a little bit further away, theme parks in California can reopen. They're not all going to reopen April 1st, but we'll start counting down to that reopening. Marvel Monday. Sorry, so we're going to start the fun tomorrow at 6. We're going to have a special feature on the Mighty Ducks franchise. Then we will have reviews of Solar Opposites, as well as the latest Into the Dark on Hulu. And then at 11 o'clock, I believe, Jeremiah will be at All-Star Movies. 1:30 Marvel Monday, where they're going to take a look at the premiere episode of Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Disney Parks Talk Live at 4 o'clock. And then at 7:30, Alex and I will be back to talk about Own the Room, the latest documentary on Disney Plus from the folks at National Geographic as part of the LP Movie Club. So we got a whole lot going on next month, tomorrow, and actually all week. So stick with us throughout, and we look forward to seeing you. And thanks, Kidder, for always being there, knowing our schedule better than we do. It's impressive, but we've got a lot going on. We're covering some great stuff that we can't exactly talk about, but the content will be on Laughing Place soon after it happens. But go ahead and follow us, ring the bell so you can know when we go live, and we will see everybody next week. Next week, LP In Depth, Alex and I will be back. It's going to be our spring content preview. So we're going to look at all the Disney networks and streaming services and look at what shows, some of which we've already talked about today, but go a little bit further in depth on what's coming from Disney in spring. Basically, we're going to go from what stuff premiering on from Sunday all the way through the end of May. So we will see you then. Bye, everybody.